The King of the World, by René Guénon, 1958, translated by Henry D. Fore, 2001, narrated by an artificial intelligence based on the voice of Orson Welles, produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. Chapter 1, Western Ideas about Agarttha, Saint-Yves d'Alveder's posthumous work Mission de l'Inde, first published in 1910, contains a description of a mysterious initiatic center called Agarttha, and many readers have no doubt assumed that this was just an imaginary tale, a sort of fiction with no basis in reality. If taken literally, it does in fact contain some improbable accounts that could justify such an appraisal, at least for those accustomed to seeing only external appearances, and Saint-Yves doubtless had good reasons for not publishing the book, which was written long ago but never brought to completion. Moreover, until the appearance of this book, there had hardly been any mention in Europe of Agarttha and its leader, the Brahmatma, except by the rather superficial writer Louis Jacoliot, 1837 to 1890, whose authority one cannot possibly invoke. In our opinion, Jacoliot had actually heard of these things while in India, but created his own fantasy about them, as he did with everything else. However, in 1924, a book entitled Beasts, Men and Gods appeared unexpectedly on the scene, in which the author, Ferdinand Ossendowski, relates the incidents of a most eventful journey he made across Central Asia in the years 1920 and 1921, including, especially in its latter part, accounts almost identical with those given by Saint-Yves, and we believe that the sensation aroused by this book at last furnishes a favorable opportunity to break the silence on the question of Agarttha. Naturally, hostile and skeptical critics did not fail to accuse Ossendowski of simply plagiarizing Saint-Yves, supporting their allegation by pointing out all the concordant passages in the two books. And in fact, there are a good number that show a rather astonishing similarity, even to points of detail. First of all, in one of his most improbable passages, Saint-Yves asserts the existence of a subterranean world with branches everywhere, under continents and even under the oceans, by means of which communications are invisibly established between all the regions of the earth. Moreover, Ossendowski does not affirm this on his own authority, even declaring that he does not know what to think of it, but attributes it rather to reports received from people he met in the course of his journey. On a more particular point, there is also a passage in which the King of the World is depicted in front of his predecessor's tomb, and where the question is raised concerning the origin of the gypsies, who, among others, are said to have lived originally in Agarttha. Saint-Yves writes that there are moments during the subterranean celebration of the cosmic mysteries when travelers upon the desert stop motionless and even the animals are silent, and Ossendowski has assured us that he himself was present at such a moment of universal contemplation. But most important of all, by a strange coincidence, both writers tell the story of an island now vanished where extraordinary men and beasts once lived. At this point, Saint-Yves cites the summary by Diodorus of Sicily of the journey of Iambulus, whereas Ossendowski describes the journey of an ancient Buddhist from Nepal. But their accounts hardly differ, so that if two versions from such widely divergent sources really do exist, it would be interesting to acquire them and compare them carefully. Although we have pointed to these similarities, it should be emphasized that we are in no way convinced that there was indeed plagiarism, and we do not in any case intend to enter into a discussion of only limited interest. We know through other sources, independent of the evidence offered by Ossendowski himself, that stories of this kind are current in Mongolia and throughout Central Asia, and we can immediately add that there is something similar in the traditions of nearly all peoples. Furthermore, if Ossendowski did in part copy from the Mission de l'Inde, it is difficult to see why he should have omitted certain passages or changed the form of certain words, writing Agarttha in place of Agarttha, for example, which on the contrary is easily explained if he received from a Mongolian source the information that Saint-Yves obtained from a Hindu source, the latter being known to have been in contact with at least 2 Hindus. Nor is it easy to understand why he would have used the title King of the World to designate the head of the initiatic hierarchy, a title that appears nowhere in Saint-Yves' work. Even if a certain amount of borrowing were admitted, the fact remains that Ossendowski sometimes says things that have no equivalent in Mission de l'Inde, and that he certainly would not have been able to invent in their entirety all the more so as he was far more preoccupied with politics than with the pursuit of ideas or doctrines, and was so ignorant of anything touching on esoterism that he was manifestly incapable of grasping the true import of such things. For example, he tells the story of the black stone that had originally been sent by the king of the world to the Dalai Lama, and subsequently transported to Urga in Mongolia, where it disappeared approximately 100 years ago. Now, in many traditions, black stones play an important role, from that played by the symbol of Symbolic to that of the stone enshrined in the Kaaba at Mecca. Here is another example. The Bogdo Khan, or living Buddha, who resides at Urga, preserves, among other precious items, the ring of Genghis Khan, on which is engraved a swastika, and a copper plaque bearing the seal of the King of the World. It seems that Ossendowski managed to see only the first of these two objects, but if this is so, would it not then have been extremely difficult for him to conjure the other from his imagination? And would it not have been more natural for him to describe a plaque of gold? These preliminary observations must suffice, for we wish to remain apart from any polemics or questions of personalities. We have only cited Ossendowski and Saint-Yves as a point of departure for considerations that have nothing to do with what one might think of either of them, and whose importance exceeds their individualities as well as our own, which in this domain should no longer count. Nor do we propose a more or less vain textual criticism, but rather a presentation of some information that, to our knowledge, has been unavailable until now, and that might help in some measure to elucidate what Ossendowski calls the mystery of mysteries. Chapter 2, Royalty and Pontificate. The title King of the World, taken in its highest, most complete, and at the same time most rigorous sense, applies properly to Manu, the primordial and universal legislator, whose name is found in diverse forms among a great many ancient peoples. In this regard, let us recall only Mina or Menes of the Egyptians, Menu of the Celts, and Minos of the Greeks. This name, moreover, does not designate a more or less legendary historical personage, but rather a principle, a cosmic intelligence that reflects pure spiritual light and formulates the law, dharma, appropriate to the conditions of our world and of our cycle of existence. And at the same time, it is the archetype of man, considered particularly insofar as he is a thinking being, in Sanskrit manava. Moreover, it is important to emphasize that this principle can be manifested through a spiritual center existing in the terrestrial world by an organization charged with preserving intact the deposit of sacred tradition, which is of non-human origin, aparusheya, through which primordial wisdom is handed down across the ages to those capable of receiving it. The head of such an organization, representing in a way Manu himself, can legitimately bear his title and attributes. And what is more, the degree of knowledge he must have attained to exercise his function enables him to truly identify himself with the principle of which he is the human expression, as it were, and before which his individuality disappears. Such is indeed the case of Agarttha, if, as Saint-Yves maintains, this center has taken over the heritage of the ancient solar dynasty, Suryavansha, which formerly resided at Ayodhya, and which traced its origin back to Vaivasvata, the Manu of the present cycle. Nevertheless, as we have said, Saint-Yves does not in fact envisage the supreme head of Agarttha as the king of the world, but presents him as sovereign pontiff, whom moreover he places at the head of a Brahmanic church, a designation that proceeds from a rather too westernized conception. This last reservation apart, what he says in this regard complements what Ossendowski says, both writers having seen only that aspect corresponding to their own tendencies and dominant preoccupations. For in truth it is here a matter of a double power, at once sacerdotal and royal. The pontific character, in the proper sense of this word, belongs most truly and par excellence to the head of the initiatic hierarchy, and this calls for an explanation. Pontifex literally means builder of bridges, and by its origin this Roman title is, as it were, Masonic, but symbolically it is that which fulfills the function of mediator, establishing communication between this world and the higher worlds. In this respect, the rainbow or celestial bridge is a natural symbol for the pontificate, and all traditions give it perfectly concordant meanings. Thus, among the Hebrews, it is the sign of God's covenant with his people. In China, it is the sign of the union of heaven and earth. In Greece, it represents Iris, the messenger of the gods, and almost everywhere among the Scandinavians as well as the Persians and Arabs in Central Africa and even among certain peoples of North America, it is the bridge that links the sensible world to the suprasensible. Among the Romans, on the other hand, this union of sacerdotal and royal power was represented by a certain aspect of the extremely complex and multivalent symbolism of Janus, whose gold and silver keys represented in this connection the two corresponding initiations. In Hindu terms, it is a matter of the ways of the Brahmin and the Kshatriya respectively. But at the summit of the hierarchy, there is a common principle from which both draw their respective attributes and which is therefore beyond these distinctions, since this principle is the source of all legitimate authority in whatever domain it is exercised, and the initiates of Agarttha are Ativana, that is to say, beyond caste. In the Middle Ages, there was an expression in which these two complementary aspects of authority were joined in an interesting way. At that time, frequent mention was made of a mysterious region called the Kingdom of Prester John. Now, this was at a time when what could be called the outer covering of the initiatic center in question was formed in large part by Nestorians, or those who were so called rightly or wrongly, and by Sabaeans, who referred to themselves as the Mendaya de Yahya, that is, disciples of John. In this connection, one is immediately prompted to remark that it is curious that many Eastern organizations, which were rigidly closed communities, from the Ismailis, or the disciples of the old man of the mountain, to the Druses of Lebanon, have without exception taken the same title guardians of the Holy Land, as did the Western orders of chivalry. What follows will no doubt clarify just what this means. It seems that Saint Yves found the right expression, perhaps more so than he himself knew, when he spoke of the Templars of Agarttha. And lest one be astonished at the expression outer covering that we have just employed, we will add that it must be understood that the chivalric initiation was essentially an initiation of the Kshatriyas, and this explains, among other things, the preponderant role played there by the symbolism of love. However that may be, the idea of one individual who is both priest and king is not current in the contemporary West, although it is found at the very origins of Christianity, where it is represented in a striking way by the Magi kings. But already by the Middle Ages, at least to outer appearances, the supreme power had become divided between the papacy and the empire. Such a separation can be considered the mark of an organization that is incomplete at its summit, so to speak, since there we do not find the common principle from which the two powers regularly proceed and on which they depend, the true supreme power having therefore to be sought elsewhere. In the East, on the contrary, the maintenance of such a separation at the very summit of the hierarchy is rather exceptional, and it is only in certain Buddhist conceptions that one encounters something of the kind. Here we allude to the incompatibility affirmed between the function of Buddha and that of Chakravarti, or the universal monarch, between which it is said Shakyamuni had to choose at a certain point. It is worth adding also that the term Chakravarti, far from being particularly Buddhist, applies very well to the function of Manu or of his representatives following the Hindu tradition. Literally, it means he who makes the wheel turn, which is to say he who, placed at the center of all things, directs their movement without himself participating therein, or according to Aristotle's expression, he who is the unmoved mover. We particularly wish to emphasize that, since the world rotates around it, the center in question is the fixed point that all traditions refer to symbolically as the pole, generally represented by a wheel among the Celts and Chaldeans as well as the Hindus. Such is the true significance of the swastika, a symbol found everywhere from the Far East to the Far West, and which is essentially the sign of the pole. And this is no doubt the first time in modern Europe that its real meaning is being made known. Indeed, contemporary scholars have employed all manner of fantastic theories in their vain efforts to explain this symbol, the majority of them obsessed by a sort of fixed idea, having been intent on seeing here, as almost everywhere else, an exclusively solar symbol, whereas, if it has occasionally become such, this could only have been by accident, as a result of some distortion. Others have come nearer the truth when they see in the swastika a symbol of movement, although this interpretation, without being false, is quite insufficient, for it is not a question of just any kind of movement, but of rotational movement around a center or immutable axis. And it is this fixed point, we repeat, that constitutes the essential element to which the symbol in question is directly related. From what we have just said, it is already clear that the king of the world must have a function that is essentially organizational and regulatory. It being not without reason, let us add, that this latter word possesses the same root as rex and regere, a function that can be summed up in words such as equilibrium or harmony, which is rendered precisely by the Sanskrit term dharma, by which we understand the reflection in the manifested world of the immutability of the supreme principle. And in the same way, it is understandable why the fundamental attributes of the king of the world are justice and peace, which are only the special forms of this equilibrium and harmony in the world of man, Manavaloka. Here again is a point of the greatest importance, which we note not only because of its general significance, but for the benefit of those who allow themselves to succumb to certain chimerical fears, of which Ossendowski's book itself contains a sort of echo in its closing lines. Chapter 3, Shekinah and Metatron. Certain timid minds whose understanding is strangely limited by preconceived notions have been frightened by the title King of the World, which they immediately associate with the Princeps Huius Mundi, Prince of this world of the Gospels. It goes without saying that such an assimilation is wholly erroneous and lacks any foundation. The issue can be laid to rest simply by observing that the title King of the World, in Hebrew and in Arabic, is readily applied to God himself, and this gives us occasion for some interesting observations concerning the theories of celestial intermediaries in the Hebrew Kabbalah, theories that have moreover a direct bearing on the principal subject of this study. The celestial intermediaries in question are the Shekinah and Metatron, the former denoting in the most general sense the real presence of the divinity. The scriptures that make special mention of this presence are above all those concerned with the establishment of a spiritual center, such as the construction of the tabernacle and the building of the temples of Solomon and of Zorobabel. Such a center, constituted in rigorously defined conditions, must be a place of divine manifestation, which is always represented as light. And it is curious to note that the expression a well-illuminated and ordered place, still retained by the Masons, seems to be a vestige of the ancient sacerdotal science that oversaw the construction of the temples, and that furthermore was not peculiar to the Jews, a point we shall take up later. Here we need not enter into the theory of spiritual influences. A better translation of the Hebrew barakoth than the usual blessings, more particularly as it keeps the sense that the Arabic baraka has retained. But even limiting ourselves to this one point of view, it is still possible to explain Elias Levita's statement, as quoted by Vouliod in his La Kabbalah Juive, that the masters of the Kabbalah hold great secrets on this subject. The Shekinah is presented under a number of aspects, among which two are primary, the one inward and the other outward. Moreover, in the Christian tradition, there is an expression that indicates these two aspects in the clearest possible way. Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax hominibus bonae voluntatis. The words gloria and pax refer respectively to the inward aspect with respect to its relation to the principle, and the outer aspect with respect to its relation to the manifested world. And in considering these words, it is immediately clear why they are spoken by the angels, Malachim, to announce the birth of God with us, or in us, Emmanuel. Regarding the first aspect, one could also recall the theories of the theologians on the light of glory in and by which the beatific vision operates in excelsis. And as to the second, we find here again the peace to which we just alluded, and which in its esoteric sense is everywhere indicated as one of the fundamental attributes of the spiritual centers established in this world, in terra. Furthermore, the Arabic term sakina, obviously identical to the Hebrew Shekinah, translates as great peace, which is an exact equivalent of the Pax Profunda of the Brotherhood of the Rose Cross. And on this basis, one could doubtless explain what the latter meant by the temple of the Holy Spirit, just as one could also give a precise interpretation to the numerous gospel texts in which peace is mentioned, all the more so as the secret tradition concerning the Shekinah must have some connection with the light of the Messiah. Was it only coincidental that in making this last point, Vouliod said that it concerns the tradition reserved for those who pursue the path leading to Pard, that is to say, as will be seen later on, to the supreme spiritual center? This leads to a related point. Vouliod speaks subsequently of a mystery related to the Jubilee, which in turn relates in one sense to the idea of peace. And in this connection, he cites the text of the Zohar, 352b. The river that flows out of Eden bears the name Iobel, as well as that of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 8. It is like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream, from which it follows that the central idea of the Jubilee is the return of all things to their primordial state. It is clear that it is this return to the primordial state envisaged by all traditions, a point upon which we had occasion to dwell in our book, The Esoterism of Dante. And if we add that the return of all things to their primordial state will herald the Messianic era, those who have read the book may then recall what it said about the relationship between the terrestrial paradise and the celestial Jerusalem. In truth, moreover, what is involved here in various phases of cyclical manifestation is always Pad, the center of this world, which the traditional symbolism of all peoples likens to the heart, the center of the being and the divine residence, Brahmapura in Hindu doctrine. The tabernacle, which is made in its image, is therefore called in Hebrew Mishkan, or dwelling of God, a word having the same root as Shekinah. From another point of view, the Shekinah is the synthesis of the Sephiroth. Now in the Sephirothic tree, the right-hand column is the side of mercy, and the left-hand column is that of rigor. We should therefore find both of these aspects in the Shekinah, and we note immediately, in connection with what was said before, that in certain respects at least, rigor is identified with justice, and mercy with peace. If man sins and strays from the Shekinah, he falls under the jurisdiction of the powers, Sarim, that derive from rigor, and then the Shekinah is called the hand of rigor, which immediately calls to mind the well-known symbol of the hand of justice. But if, on the contrary, a man approaches the Shekinah, he will be liberated. And then the Shekinah is the right hand of God, which is to say that the hand of justice becomes the hand of blessing. These are the mysteries of the house of justice, Beit Din, which is yet another designation of the supreme spiritual center. And it is scarcely necessary to point out that the two sides under discussion are identical to those into which the elect and the damned are separated in Christian representations of the Last Judgment. One could equally well establish a connection with the two paths which the Pythagoreans symbolized by the letter E, represented exoterically as virtue and vice in the myth of Hercules, as well as with the two doors, celestial and infernal, which the Romans associated with the symbolism of Janus, and also with the two cyclical phases, ascending and descending, which the Hindus similarly associated with the symbolism of Ganesha. Finally, it is easy to understand from all this what is truly meant by such expressions as right intention, to which we shall return later, and goodwill. When one leaves aside all those external interpretations, moral and philosophical, to which they have given rise from the Stoics through Kant. The Kabbalah gives to the Shekinah a consort who bears names identical with her own and consequently possesses the same characteristics, and who naturally also possesses as many different aspects as the Shekinah herself. His name is Metatron, which is numerically equivalent to that of Shaddai, the all-powerful, said to be the name of the God of Abraham. The etymology of the word Metatron is most obscure. Among the many hypotheses that have been advanced, one of the most interesting is its derivation from the Chaldean Mitra, which means rain, and which by its root is also sometimes related to light. Even if this is so, the similarity with the Hindu and Zoroastrian Mitra does not constitute a sufficient reason to conclude that it represents a Jewish borrowing from foreign doctrines, for it is not in this wholly external manner that the relationship existing between the different traditions should be envisaged. And we shall say the same concerning the role attributed to rain in almost all traditions, insofar as it is a symbol of the descent of spiritual influences from heaven to earth. Moreover, it is worth noting in this connection that the Hebraic doctrine speaks of a dew of light emanating from the tree of life, by which the resurrection of the dead is to be effected, as well as of an effusion of dew that represents the celestial influence communicating itself to all the worlds, which is singularly reminiscent of alchemical and Rosicrucian symbolism. The term Metatron conveys the multiple meanings of guardian, lord, messenger, mediator. He is the author of theophanies in the world of the senses. He is the angel of the face, and also the prince of the world, Sar HaOlam, this last designation indicating that we have not strayed from our subject. Employing the traditional symbolism that has already been explained, we readily say that just as the head of the initiatic hierarchy is the terrestrial pole, so Metatron is the celestial pole. The latter has his reflection in the former, with whom he stands in direct relation through the world axis. His name is Michael, the great priest who is both holocaust and oblation before God. And everything the Israelites do on earth is accomplished according to the archetypes of events in the celestial world. The great pontiff here below represents Michael, Prince of Mercy. Every scriptural passage that tells of an appearance of Michael is also concerned with the glory of the Shekinah. What is said here of the Israelites could equally well be said of all peoples possessing a genuinely orthodox tradition, and all the more so of the representatives of the primordial tradition, from which all the other traditions derive and to which they are subordinate, all this in accord with the symbolism of the Holy Land, an image of the celestial world to which we have already alluded. Moreover, according to what was said above, Metatron possesses not only the aspect of mercy, but also that of justice. He is not only the great priest, Kohen HaGadol, but also the great prince, Sar HaGadol, and commander of the celestial hosts, which is to say that in him lies both the principle of the royal power and that of the sacerdotal or pontifical power, to which properly corresponds the function of mediator. And we should add that Melek, king, and Malak, angel or messenger, are really two forms of one and the same word. And in addition, Malachi, my messenger, that is the messenger of God, or the angel in whom God dwells, Malach ha-Elohim, is an anagram of Michael. It is proper to add that if Michael is identified with Metatron, as we have just seen, he nevertheless represents only one aspect of him. Besides the luminous face, there is a dark face represented by Samael, who is called also Sar ha-Olam, thereby bringing us back to the point of departure in this discussion. It is in fact this latter aspect, and it alone, that symbolizes in an inferior sense the spirit of this world, the princeps huius mundi referred to in the Gospels, and its connection with Metatron, of whom it is the shadow, so to speak, justifies the use of the one title in a twofold sense, at the same time making clear why the apocalyptic number 666, the number of the beast, is also a solar number. According to Saint Hippolytus, the Messiah and the Antichrist both have the lion for their emblem, and it too is a solar symbol. And the same could be said of the serpent and of many other symbols. From a Kabbalistic point of view, it is again the two opposing faces of Metatron that are here in question. At this point, we need not enter into the theories that could be formulated in a general way on this double meaning of symbols, but will only note that the confusion between the luminous and dark aspects is what properly constitutes Satanism, and that it is precisely this confusion which allows some, no doubt unintentionally and through simple ignorance, an excuse but not a justification, to believe that they have uncovered an infernal significance in the title King of the World. Chapter 4. The Three Supreme Functions. According to Saint Yves, the supreme head of Agarttha bears the title of Brahatma. It would be more correct to say Brahmatma, or support of souls in the spirit of God. His two adjuncts are the Mahatma, representative of the universal soul, and the Mahanga, symbol of the entire material organization of the cosmos. These comprise the hierarchic division represented in Western doctrines by the ternary of spirit, soul, and body, applied here according to the analogy of the macrocosm and the microcosm. It is important to note that these terms in Sanskrit properly denote principles, and that they cannot be applied to human beings except insofar as they represent these principles, so that even in such cases they are attached essentially to functions and not to individualities. According to Ossendowski, the Mahatma knows the events of the future, and the Mahanga directs the course of those events. As for the Brahatma, he is able to speak to God face to face, and it is easy to understand what this means if one remembers that he occupies the central point from which direct communication is established between the terrestrial world and the superior states, and through these latter with the supreme principle. Besides, if the term King of the World were interpreted in a restricted sense and solely in relation to the terrestrial world, it would prove inadequate. It would be more accurate in certain respects to designate Brahatma as Lord of the three worlds, for in every true hierarchy, he who possesses the superior degree thereby also possesses at the same time all the subordinate degrees, and as we shall explain further on, these three worlds, which constitute the Tribhuvana of Hindu tradition, are the domains corresponding respectively to the three functions we are about to specify. As he comes forth from the temple, writes Ossendowski, the king of the world radiates divine light. The Hebrew Bible reports exactly the same of Moses when he came down from Mount Sinai, and in this connection it is worth noting that the Islamic tradition regards Moses as the pole, al-Qutb, of his age. Besides, was it not for this reason that according to the Kabbalah, he was instructed by Metatron himself? It is important here again to distinguish between the principal spiritual center of our world and the secondary centers subordinate to it that represent it only in relation to particular traditions, adapted more particularly to specific peoples. Without wishing to belabor the point, we should nonetheless note that the function of legislator, in Arabic Rasul, belonging to Moses, necessarily supposes a delegation of the power designated by the name Manu. Moreover, one of the meanings implicit in this name indicates precisely the reflection of divine light. The king of the world, said a Lama to Ossendowski, is in contact with the thoughts of all the men who influence the lot and life of all humankind. He realizes all their thoughts and plans. If these be pleasing before God, the king of the world will invisibly help them. If they are unpleasant in the sight of God, the king will bring them to destruction. This power is given to Agarttha by the mysterious science of Om, with which we begin all our prayers. There immediately follows a sentence that will greatly astonish those who have only a vague idea of the significance of this sacred monosyllable. Om is the name of an ancient holy man, the first Goro, Ossendowski writes Goro for Guru, who lived 300,000 years ago. This sentence would be completely unintelligible were it not borne in mind that the age in question, which moreover seems indicated rather vaguely, is very much anterior to the era of the present Manu. Furthermore, the Adi Manu, or first Manu of our present Kalpa, Vaivasvata being the seventh, is called Svayambhuva, that is to say, issue of Svayambhu, he who subsists of himself, or the eternal Logos. But the Logos, or he who represents it directly, can truly be designated the first Guru or spiritual master, which in effect means that Om is another of the names of the Logos. Moreover, the word Om immediately provides a key to the hierarchical distribution of functions between Brahmatma and his two adjuncts, as we have already indicated. According to Hindu tradition, the three elements of this sacred monosyllable symbolize, respectively, the three worlds just alluded to, the three parts of the Tribhuvana, earth, Bhu, atmosphere, Bhuvas, and the heavens, Swar, which, to use a different terminology, correspond to the world of corporeal manifestation, the world of subtle or psychic manifestation, and the non-manifested principial world. In ascending order, these are the domains of the Mahanga, the Mahatma, and the Brahmatma, as can easily be seen by referring to the interpretation of their titles above. And it is the relationships of subordination among these different domains that justifies the previous interpretation of Brahmatma as Lord of the three worlds. This one is the Lord of all. This one is the omniscient who sees at once all effects in their cause. This one is the inner director of all who resides at the center of the world and governs it from within, directing its movement without participating in it. This one is the source of all legitimate power. This one is verily the place of origin and dissolution of all beings, of the cyclical manifestation whose law he represents. To use still another symbolism that is no less exact, we can say that the Mahanga represents the base of the initiatic triangle and the Brahmatma its summit. Between these two, the Mahatma embodies in a certain way a mediating principle, the cosmic vitality, the anima mundi of the Hermeticists, whose action is deployed in the intermediate realm. All of this is represented very clearly by the corresponding letters of the sacred alphabet that Saint Yves calls Vatan, and that Ossendowski calls Vatanan, or which amounts to the same thing, by the geometric forms, straight line, spiral, and point, to which the three matras, or elements constituting the monosyllable Om, can be reduced. Let us make this even clearer. To the Brahmatma belongs the fullness of both the sacerdotal and the royal power, envisaged principially in a kind of undifferentiated state. The two powers are subsequently differentiated in order to be manifested, the Mahatma representing more particularly the sacerdotal power and the Mahanga the royal power. The distinction corresponds to that between Brahmins and Kshatriyas, although in other respects the Mahatma and the Mahanga, being beyond caste, have in themselves, as does the Brahatma, a character at once sacerdotal and royal. This raises a most important point that seems never to have been explained satisfactorily. It has already been mentioned that the two powers were united in the Magi kings of the Gospels. We can now say that in reality these mysterious personages represent nothing other than the three heads of Agarttha. The Mahanga offers gold to Christ and hails him as king. The Mahatma offers incense and hails him as priest. And finally, the Brahatma, hailing him as prophet or spiritual master par excellence, offers myrrh, the balm of incorruptibility, symbol of Amrita. The homage rendered in this way to the newborn Christ by the authentic representatives of the primordial tradition in the three worlds which are their respective domains is at the same time, we should clearly note, the assurance of the perfect orthodoxy of Christianity in this respect. Ossendowski naturally was not in a position to consider things of this order, but had he penetrated more deeply into certain matters, he would at least have noticed the strict analogy obtaining between the supreme ternary of Agarttha and that of Lamaism, such as he describes it, the Dalai Lama realizing the saintliness or pure spirituality of Buddha, the Tashi Lama realizing his science, not magic as he appears to think, but rather theurgy, and the Bogdo Khan representing his material and warlike strength, exactly the same distribution according to the three worlds. He could even have drawn these parallels all the more readily since he had been informed that the capital of Agarttha reminds one of Lhasa, where the palace of the Dalai Lama, the Potala, is the top of a mountain covered with monasteries and temples. This way of expressing things is faulty besides, for in reality it is the image that recalls its prototype and not the converse. Now the center of Lamaism can only be an image of the true center of the world. But when the various sites of such centers are considered, it turns out that they all present certain topographical peculiarities that, far from being unimportant, have an incontestable symbolic value that must, in addition, correspond to those laws through which the spiritual influences operate, which is a topic that properly belongs to the traditional science that one could call sacred geography. But there is yet another parallel that is no less remarkable. Saint Yves, describing the different degrees or circles of the initiatic hierarchy, which are related to certain symbolic numerals referring particularly to the divisions of time, ends by saying that the highest circle, and the one nearest to the mysterious center, is composed of 12 parts, which represent the supreme initiation and correspond to the zodiac, among other things. Now, this composition is also found in what is known as the Circular Council of the Dalai Lama, made up of 12 great namshans, or nomikans, and moreover is also found even in certain Western traditions, notably those concerning the Knights of the Round Table. We should further add that from the point of view of the cosmic order, the 12 members of the inner circle of Agarttha represent not only the 12 signs of the zodiac, but also, we are tempted to say, rather, though the two interpretations are not mutually exclusive, the 12 Adityas, which represent as many forms of the sun in relation to these same zodiacal signs. And naturally, since Manu Vaivasvata is called son of the sun, the king of the world also counts the sun among his various emblems. The principal conclusion to be drawn from what has been said is that all the world over descriptions of spiritual centers that are more or less hidden, or at least accessible only with great difficulty, bear a close resemblance to each other. The only plausible explanation for this similarity is that if the accounts refer to different centers, as seems to be true in some cases, then they must all be emanations, so to speak, from one supreme center, just as all particular traditions are finally only adaptations of the great primordial tradition. Chapter 5. Symbolism of the Grail. The Knights of the Round Table were mentioned in the previous chapter, and it will not be outside our purview to call attention to the significance of the Grail quest, which in legends of Celtic origin is presented as their principal concern. All traditions allude to something that from a certain time become lost or hidden, such as the Soma of the Hindus and the Persian Haoma or draught of immortality, these latter having a precise and very direct connection with the Grail, which was said to be the sacred chalice that contained the blood of Christ, another draught of immortality. Elsewhere, the symbolism is different, as, for example, among the Jews, where it is the pronunciation of the full divine name that has been lost. But the fundamental idea is always the same, and we will shortly see to what exactly it corresponds. It is said that the Holy Grail is the chalice that served at the Last Supper, and in which Joseph of Arimathea collected the blood and water flowing from the wound opened in Christ's side by the lance of the centurion Longinus. According to legend, this chalice was carried to England by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, indicating a link between the Celtic tradition and Christianity. The chalice, in fact, plays an important role in most of the ancient traditions, no doubt most notably among the Celts, and equally worth noting is its frequent association with the lance, these two symbols thus being in some way complementary, but to digress on this point would take us far from our present subject. The essential significance of the Grail is perhaps shown most clearly by what is said of its origin. It is supposed to have been fashioned by angels from an emerald that dropped from Lucifer's forehead at the time of his fall. This emerald rather strikingly calls to mind the urna, or frontal pearl, which in Hindu symbolism, and subsequently adopted by Buddhism, often takes the place of the third eye of Shiva, representing what can be called the sense of eternity, as we have explained elsewhere. It is said, too, that the Grail had been entrusted to Adam in the terrestrial paradise, but that after his fall he lost it in turn, for he was not allowed to take it when he was driven from Eden, the significance of which should be clear, given what we have just said. Separated from his center of origin, man found himself thereafter enclosed in the temporal realm, from which he could no longer return to that unique place whence all things are contemplated under the aspect of eternity. In other words, the possession of the sense of eternity is linked to what all the traditions call, as we mentioned above, the primordial state, the restoration of which constitutes the first stage of true initiation, as it is the preliminary condition for the effective conquest of the suprahuman states. The terrestrial paradise, moreover, properly represents the center of the world, an expression that will be better understood later when the original meaning of the word paradise is examined. The following may appear even more enigmatic. Seth succeeded in re-entering the terrestrial paradise and was thus able to recover the precious chalice. Now, the name Seth expresses the idea of foundation or stability, and hence indicates in some way the restoration of the primordial order destroyed by man's fall. One must therefore understand that both Seth and those who later possessed the Grail were thereby able to establish a spiritual center destined to replace the lost paradise, a kind of image of the latter, with the possession of the Grail then representing the integral preservation of the primordial tradition in such a spiritual center. The legend does not record where or by whom the Grail was preserved until the time of Christ, although the Celtic origin attributed to it suggests that the Druids had a role and should be counted among the regular guardians of the primordial tradition. The loss of the Grail, or of any of its symbolic equivalents, amounts to the loss of tradition, along with all that it conveys, but in fact it is more true to say that the tradition is hidden rather than lost, or at least that it can be lost only to certain secondary spiritual centers that have ceased to maintain a direct contact with the supreme center. This latter always preserves intact the deposit of the tradition and remains unaffected by any changes occurring in the outer world. Thus it is that, according to various church fathers, notably St. Augustine, the deluge did not reach as far as the terrestrial paradise, which is the dwelling place of Enoch and land of saints, and the summit of which touches the lunar sphere, that is, lies beyond the domain of change, the sublunary world, at the meeting point of the earth and the heavens. But even as the terrestrial paradise has become inaccessible, so the supreme center, which is fundamentally the same thing, can cease to be manifested outwardly during the course of certain periods, and then it can be said that the tradition is lost to the great mass of humanity, for it is preserved only in certain strictly closed centers, so that, in contrast to the original state, the majority of people can no longer participate in it in a conscious or effective manner. This is precisely the state of affairs in our present age, the beginning of which stretches back well beyond what is accessible to ordinary and profane history. Thus, according to the case, the loss of tradition can be understood in this general sense. or else be related to the obscuration of the spiritual centers that more or less invisibly govern the destinies of particular peoples or civilizations. And so every instance of a symbolism that relates to it must be examined to determine in which of these two senses it should be interpreted. From what has been said, it follows that the Grail simultaneously represents two closely related things. For anyone who possesses the primordial tradition in its integrality, that is, who has attained the degree of effective knowledge that this possession essentially implies, is thereby effectively reintegrated into the fullness of the primordial state. To both these, the primordial state and the primordial tradition, we attach the double sense inhering in the word Grail itself, for by one of those verbal assimilations that play a not at all negligible role in symbolism, and that furthermore have much more profound reasons than might be imagined at first glance, the Grail is both avase, grasal, and abuk, gradel or graduel, the latter obviously signifying tradition, while the first more directly concerns the state itself. We have no intention of entering here into the secondary details of the legend of the Holy Grail, even though all of these too have a symbolic value, or of pursuing the history of the Knights of the Round Table and their exploits. We will only point out that the Round Table, built by King Arthur according to Merlin's specifications, was destined to receive the Grail at such time that it would be won by one of the knights and brought back from Great Britain to Brittany. The table itself is again another of those apparently very ancient symbols that were always associated with the idea of spiritual centers as guardians of the tradition. Moreover, the circular shape of the table is formally linked to the zodiac by the presence around it of 12 principal personages, a detail which, as we said above, is to be found in the constitution of all such centers. Another symbol related to an aspect of the Grail legend and deserving special attention is Montsalvat, literally Mount of Salvation, represented as rising out of the midst of the sea in an inaccessible region behind which the sun rises, its peak situated on distant shores no mortal can approach. It is at one and the same time the sacred isle and the polar mountain, two equivalent symbols that will be discussed later, and it is the land of immortality, which is naturally identified with the terrestrial paradise. Returning to the Grail itself, we can easily see that its primary significance is basically the same as that of the sacred vase, wherever it is found, and which, notably in the East, is that of the sacrificial vessel that originally held the Vedic Soma, or Mazdian Haoma, the draught of immortality that bestows upon or restores to those who take it with the requisite disposition the sense of eternity. A separate study would be required to cover fully the symbolism of the chalice and its contents, but what has been said will lead us to other considerations of the greatest importance to the present subject. Chapter 6, Melki-Tsedeq. Eastern traditions relate that at a certain time the Soma became unknown, so that in sacrificial rites it was necessary to substitute for it another beverage that was no more than a symbol of the original. This was the role played principally by wine, to which a large part of the Greek legend of Dionysos is devoted. Now wine is often taken to represent the authentic initiatic tradition. In Hebrew, the words yayin, wine, and sod, mystery, share the same number and are thus interchangeable. And among the Sufis, wine symbolizes esoteric knowledge, that is, the doctrine reserved for the elite and not suitable for everyone, just as everyone cannot drink wine with impunity. It follows from this that the use of wine in a rite confers upon that rite a clearly initiatic character. Such is the case, notably, of the Eucharistic sacrifice of Melki-Tsedeq, which is the essential point upon which we shall now dwell. The name Melki-Tsedeq, or more precisely, Melki-Tsedeq, is in fact none other than the title used in the Judeo-Christian tradition to expressly designate the function of the king of the world. We were somewhat hesitant to mention this fact, a fact that can help explain one of the most enigmatic passages of the Hebrew Bible. But once we decided to treat the question of the king of the world, we could hardly pass over it in silence. In this regard, let us recall here the words of St. Paul. About this, we have much to say which is hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing. The biblical text which prompts us to make these remarks is the following. And Melki-Tsedeq, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, El Elyon. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth, And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Melki-Tsedeq is thus both king and priest. His name means king of justice, and he is at the same time king of Salem, that is to say of peace. So here again we find above all justice and peace, which are precisely the two fundamental attributes of the king of the world. It should also be pointed out that contrary to common opinion, the word Salem never actually designated a city, even though taken as the symbolic name of the residence of Melki-Tsedeq, it can be considered the equivalent of Agarttha. In any case, it is an error to see in it the primitive name for Jerusalem, as the latter was originally called Jebus. On the contrary, if the name Jerusalem was given to that city when a spiritual center was established there by the Jews, this was to indicate that from that point on it was a sort of visible image of the true Salem. And it should be noted that the temple was built by Solomon, whose name, Shlomo, is also derived from Salem and means the peaceable one. Let us see how Paul comments on what is said of Melki-Tsedeq. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned 1/10 part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness. And then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, and has neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Now Melchizedek is here represented as superior to Abraham, for he blesses him, and it is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. And for his part, Abraham recognizes this superiority by giving the tithe, a mark of his dependence. We have here a veritable investiture, almost in the feudal sense of the word, but with the difference that it is a spiritual investiture. And it is here, let us add, that we find the exact point of juncture between the Hebraic tradition and the great primordial tradition. The blessing spoken of is properly the communication of a spiritual influence in which Abraham is henceforth to participate. And we can note that the formula that was used placed Abraham in direct relationship with the Most High God, whom the same Abraham afterward invokes under the name of Jehovah. If Melki-Tsedeq is thus superior to Abraham, it is because the Most High, Elyon, who is the God of Melki-Tsedeq, is himself superior to the all-powerful, Shaddai, who is the God of Abraham, which is to say that the first of these two names represents a divine aspect higher than the second. Moreover, an extremely important point that seems never to have been noticed is that El Elyon is the equivalent of Emmanuel, these two names having exactly the same numerical value. And this links the story of Melki-Tsedeq directly with that of the Magi kings, whose meaning we have already explained. This becomes even more evident when we recall that the priesthood of Melki-Tsedeq is that of El Elyon, while the Christian priesthood is that of Emmanuel. If then El Elyon is Emmanuel, these two priesthoods are in fact one, and so the Christian priesthood, which moreover essentially entails the Eucharistic offering of bread and wine, is truly after the order of Melchizedek. Judeo-Christian tradition distinguishes two priesthoods, one after the order of Aaron, and the other after the order of Melchizedek. The latter is superior to the former, just as Melchizedek is superior to Abraham, from whom issues the tribe of Levi, and consequently the family of Aaron. This superiority is clearly affirmed by Paul, who said that one might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes from the people of Israel, paid tithes through Abraham. Although we shall not pursue this question of the significance of the two priesthoods here, these additional words of St. Paul are worth quoting. Here in the Levitical priesthood, tithes are received by mortal men, there by one of whom it is testified that he lives. This one that lives, who is Melki-Tsedeq, is also Manu, of whom it can indeed be said that he continues a priest forever, in Hebrew Leolam, that is, for the entire duration of his cycle, Manvantara, or of the world over which he specifically rules. That is why he is without genealogy, for his origin is non-human, since he is himself the prototype of man, truly resembling the Son of God, since by virtue of the law that he formulates, he is for this world the very image of the divine word. Foremost among other points that we could raise is the observation that the story of the Magi kings presents three distinct personages, who are the three heads of the initiatic hierarchy, whereas that of Melki-Tsedeq presents only one, though one able to unite in himself aspects corresponding to the same three functions. This is why some have made a further distinction by identifying Adoni-Tzedek, the Lord of Justice, as he who divides, as it were, into Cohen-Tzedek, priest of justice, and Melki-Tsedeq, king of justice. These three aspects being in fact assimilable, respectively, to the functions of the Brahatma, the Mahatma, and the Mahanga. Although Melki-Tsedeq is properly only the name of the third aspect, it is usually applied by extension to the three as a whole, and if it is thus employed in preference to the others, this is because the function it expresses is nearest to the outer world, and thus that which is manifested most immediately. It can be said, moreover, that the expression king of the world, as well as king of justice, refers directly to the royal power only, and in India we also find the expression Dharma Raja, which is the literal equivalent of Melki-Tsedeq. If we now take Melki-Tsedeq's name in its strictest sense, the attributes proper to the king of justice are the scales and the sword, the same attributes that characterize Michael, considered as angel of judgment. In the social order, these two emblems represent, respectively, the administrative and the military functions that properly belong to the Kshatriyas, and are the two elements constituting royal power. Considered hieroglyphically, they are also the two characters forming the Arabic and Hebraic root hak, which signifies both justice and truth, and which also serve to denote royalty among various ancient peoples. Hak is the power that establishes the rule of justice, that is, the equilibrium symbolized by the scales, whereas power itself is symbolized by the sword, which is exactly what characterizes the essential role of the royal power. In the spiritual order, on the other hand, it is the power of truth. We must add, moreover, that a modified form of the root hak also exists, obtained by substituting the sign of spiritual power for that of material power, and since this form hak properly designates wisdom, in Hebrew hokmah, it is more appropriate for sacerdotal authority, just as the other is for royal power. This is further confirmed by the fact that the two corresponding forms are found with similar meanings in the root khan, which in very diverse languages signifies power or efficacy, and also knowledge, khan being above all spiritual or intellectual power, identical with wisdom, whence Kohen, priest in Hebrew, whereas kwan is the material power, from which are derived many words expressing the idea of possession, notably the word quine. These roots and their derivatives could no doubt give rise to many other considerations, but we shall have to restrict ourselves here to what bears most directly on the subject at hand. We may complete this line of thought by recalling that the Hebrew Kabbalah states that the Shekinah is represented in the inferior world by the last of the 10 Sephiroth, called Malkuth, meaning kingdom, a designation of particular interest from our present point of view. But even more interesting is the fact that among the synonyms sometimes given for Malkuth, we find Tzedek, or the just. This convergence of Malkuth and Tzedek, or of royalty, the government of the world, and justice, is met with again precisely in the name Melki-Tsedeq. In this context, it represents the distributive and rightly balanced justice found in the middle column of the Sephirothic tree. It must be distinguished from the justice opposed to mercy, which is identified with rigor in the left-hand column, for these are two different aspects, which Hebrew distinguishes respectively by the words tzedakah and din. It is the first of these that denotes justice in both the strictest and the most complete sense of the word, implying essentially the idea of balance or harmony and indissolubly linked with peace. Malkuth is the reservoir where the waters that flow from the river on high, that is to say, all the emanations, graces or spiritual influences that are poured out so abundantly, reunite. This river on high and the waters that descend from it are strangely reminiscent of the role attributed to the celestial river Ganga in the Hindu tradition. And one could also say that Shakti, of which the Ganga is an aspect, is not without analogy to the Shekinah, were it only by reason of the providential function common to them both. The reservoir of the celestial waters is naturally identical with the spiritual center of our world, from which the 4 rivers of Pards make their way toward the 4 cardinal points. The Jews identify the spiritual center with Mount Zion, calling it the heart of the world, a designation that is in any case common to all holy lands, and that for them becomes somewhat equivalent to the Meru of the Hindus or the Alborg of the Persians. The tabernacle of the holiness of Jehovah, the residence of the Shekinah, is the Holy of Holies, That is the heart of the temple, which is itself the center of Zion, Jerusalem, just as holy Zion is the center of the land of Israel, and as the land of Israel is the center of the world. This can be pushed even further, not only by listing every name enumerated above in an inverse order, but also by adding after the tabernacle in the temple, the Ark of the Covenant in the tabernacle, and then, on the Ark of the Covenant itself, the place where the Shekinah is manifested between the two cherubim. All this representing so many successive approximations to the spiritual pole. Dante depicts Jerusalem as the spiritual pole in precisely this way, as we have explained elsewhere. But the moment we leave behind the strictly Judaic point of view, this pole becomes primarily symbolic and does not constitute a localization in the strict sense of the word. All the secondary spiritual centers, constituted with a view to adaptations of the primordial tradition to determined conditions, are, as we have already shown, images of the supreme center. In reality, Zion can only be one of these secondary centers, although it may still be identified symbolically with the supreme center by reason of this similarity. Jerusalem, as its name indicates, is indeed an image of the true Salem, and what has been said and will be said further about the Holy Land, which is not merely the land of Israel, will help us to understand this point without difficulty. In this connection, another very remarkable expression used as a synonym for the Holy Land is the land of the living. It obviously designates the abode of immortality, and so is applicable, strictly speaking, to the terrestrial paradise or its symbolic equivalents. But this name was also carried over to the secondary Holy Lands, notably the land of Israel. It is said that the land of the living comprises 7 lands, about which Vouliard observes that this land is Canaan, in which there were 7 peoples. No doubt this is correct in the literal sense, but symbolically these 7 lands, as also those in the Islamic tradition, could equally well correspond to the 7 Dvipas, which, according to Hindu tradition, have Meru as a common center, a point to which we shall return. There is also a striking resemblance, which can hardly be accidental, between the epochs of the 7 Manus, counting from the beginning of this Kalpa up to the present age, and the former worlds, or the creations prior to our own, represented by the 7 kings of Edom, the number 7 in this context referring to the 7 days of Genesis. Chapter 7. Luz, Abode of Immortality. Traditions telling of a subterranean world are found among many peoples, and we do not intend to collect them all here, especially since some do not seem to have any direct relevance to our topic. It is worth noting in a general way, however, that the cult of the caverns is always more or less linked to the idea of an interior place or a central place, and that in this connection the symbol of the cave and that of the heart closely converge. On the other hand, in Central Asia, as in America and possibly elsewhere, there actually are caverns and underground sites where certain initiatic centers have been able to persist for centuries. But aside from these particular facts, from all that has been reported on this subject, it is not difficult to distill a certain symbolism. Indeed, we can even say that it is precisely considerations of a symbolic nature that have determined the choice of these subterranean locations for the establishment of initiatic centers, much more than any simple reasons of prudence. Perhaps Saint-Yves may have been able to explain this symbolism, but he failed to do so, and this is what lends the appearance of fantasy to certain portions of his work. As for Ossendowski, he was surely not capable of going beyond what he had been told, and of seeing in it any but the most literal meaning. Among the traditions alluded to above is one of particular interest, which is found in Judaism, and concerns a mysterious city called Luz. This name was originally that of the place where Jacob had his dream, and which he subsequently called Beth El, or House of God, a point to which we shall return. It is said that the angel of death could not enter this city and wielded no power over it, and by a rather singular and very significant convergence, some locate it near Alborg, which is likewise the abode of immortality for the Persians. Near Luz there is purported to be an almond tree, also called Luz in Hebrew, at the base of which is a hollow through which one enters an underground passage. This passage leads to the city itself, which remains completely hidden. Moreover, in its various meanings, the word Luz appears to be derived from a root denoting everything that is hidden, covered, enveloped, silent, and secret. And it is interesting to note that words designating the heavens originally had the same meaning. We usually equate coelum Latin for heaven or sky with the Greek koilon or hollow, which may also have some connection with the cavern, especially since Varro indicates this relationship with the expression acavo coelum. But we must also note that the oldest and most accurate form is judged to be kailum, which recalls very closely the verb kailare, to hide. In Sanskrit, moreover, Varuna derives from the root var, to cover, which is also the meaning of the root kal, related in turn to the Latin celare, another form of kailare, and to its Greek synonym kaluptin, and the Greek uranos is only another form of the same noun, var easily changing to ur. These words thus signify that which covers, that which conceals, or that which is hidden, and this last has a double sense. Considered as what is hidden from the senses, it is the suprasensible realm, but during periods of darkness or obscuration, it is the tradition, now no longer externally and openly manifested, the celestial world thus becoming the subterranean world. There is yet another connection to be made with the heavens. Luz is called the blue city, and the color blue, which is that of the sapphire, is the celestial color. In India, it is said that the blue color of the atmosphere is produced by the reflection of light on the southern face of Meru, which looks out upon the Jambudvipa and is made of sapphire. This obviously refers to the same symbolism. Moreover, the Jambudvipa represents not only India in the usual sense, but in reality also the entire terrestrial world in its present state. And in fact, this world can be regarded as situated entirely to the south of Meru, since the latter is identified with the North Pole. The 7 Dvipas, literally islands or continents, emerge successively during the course of certain cyclical periods, so that each is the terrestrial world envisaged in the corresponding period. They form a lotus having Meru as the center, with respect to which they are oriented according to the 7 regions of space. One face of Meru is thus turned toward each of the 7 Dvipas, and if each of these faces is one of the colors of the rainbow, the synthesis of these will be the color white, which is universally attributed to the supreme spiritual authority, and which is the color of Meru considered in itself. We shall see that it is indeed called the White Mountain, whereas the other colors only represent its aspects in relation to the different Dvipas. It may seem that Meru occupies a different position during the period of manifestation of each Dvipa, but in reality it is immovable because it is the center, and it is the orientation of the terrestrial world with respect to it that changes from one period to the next. Let us return to the Hebrew word luz, the many different meanings of which merit careful attention. In the ordinary sense, it means almond, as well as almond tree, designating by extension both the tree and its fruit, or kernel. Now, the kernel is what is innermost or most hidden, and it is completely enclosed, from which stems the idea of inviolability, which is also found in the name Agarttha. But luz is also the name given to an indestructible corporeal particle, symbolically represented as an extremely hard bone, to which the soul, after death, remains linked until the resurrection. As the kernel contains the germ, and as the bone contains the marrow, so this luz contains the virtual elements necessary for the restoration of the being, and this restoration will be effected under the influence of a celestial dew that will revivify the dry bones. St. Paul alludes to this in the clearest possible way when he says, "It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory." Here, as elsewhere, glory refers to the Shekinah, here envisaged in the superior world, and to which the celestial dew is closely related, as was noted earlier. Luz, being imperishable, is the kernel of immortality in the human being, just as the city that is designated by the same name is the abode of immortality. This is where the power of the angel of death stops in both cases. It is a sort of egg or embryo of the immortal. It may also be compared with the chrysalis from which the butterfly emerges, a comparison which exactly conveys its role with respect to the resurrection. The luz is said to be located toward the lower end of the spinal column. This might seem rather strange, but becomes clear when it is compared with what the Hindu tradition says about the power called Kundalini, which is a form of Shakti considered as immanent in the human being. This force is represented by the figure of a coiled snake in a region of the subtle body corresponding precisely to the base of the spinal column. This at least is the case in the ordinary man. but by means of practices such as those of Hatha Yoga, it is aroused, uncoils, and ascends through the wheels, chakras or lotuses, kamalas, that correspond to the various plexuses to reach finally the region corresponding to the third eye, that is, the frontal eye of Shiva. This stage represents the restoration of the primordial state in which man recovers the sense of eternity, thereby attaining what we have elsewhere called virtual immortality. Up to this point, we are still in the human state. In a subsequent phase, the Kundalini finally reaches the crown of the head, and this last phase relates to the effective conquest of the higher states of the being. What seems to follow from this comparison is that the location of the loose in the lower part of the organism refers only to the condition of fallen man. And for terrestrial humanity considered as a whole, the same could be said of the location of the supreme spiritual center in the subterranean world. Chapter 8. The supreme center concealed during the Kali-Yuga. Agarttha, it is said, was not in fact always underground and will not always remain so. According to Ossendowski's report, a time will come when the peoples of Agarttha will come up from their subterranean caverns to the surface of the earth. Before its disappearance from the visible world, this center bore another name, for Agarttha, which means imperceptible or inaccessible, and also inviolable, since it is Salem, the abode of peace, would not yet have been appropriate. Ossendowski clearly states that it withdrew underground more than 6,000 years ago, indicating thereby a date which, as it happens, very closely approximates the beginning of the Kali-Yuga or Dark Age, the Iron Age of the ancient West, which is the last of the 4 periods into which the Manvantara is divided. Its reappearance is to coincide with the ending of this same period. We have already mentioned the allusions in all traditions to something that is lost or hidden, which is represented under various symbols. Taken in the general sense that concerns terrestrial humanity as a whole, this loss corresponds precisely to the conditions of humanity during the Kali-Yuga. The present period is therefore one of obscuration and confusion. Its conditions are such that, as long as they endure, initiatic knowledge must necessarily remain hidden, and this explains the character of the mysteries of historical antiquity, which in fact does not even reach back to the beginning of this period, and the secret societies of all peoples. Such organizations transmit an effective initiation wherever a true traditional doctrine still subsists, but offer no more than its pale shadow when the spirit of this doctrine has ceased to vivify the symbols that are only its outward representation. This happens when, for various reasons, all conscious connection with the spiritual center of the world has finally been broken. This is the more particular meaning of the loss of tradition as concerns specific secondary centers, which consists in a rupture of effective relations with the supreme center. Thus, as we have already said, one should speak of something that is hidden rather than of something truly lost, for it is not lost to everyone, and some few still possess it in its integrality. And if such is the case, others always have the possibility of recovering it provided they search for it in the right way, which is to say that their intention must be directed so that through the harmonic vibrations it awakens. According to the law of concordant actions and reactions, they are enabled to establish an effective spiritual communication with this supreme center. In all traditional forms, this directing of the intention is, moreover, always symbolically represented by ritual orientation. Properly speaking, the latter is in fact the direction toward some spiritual center, which, no matter what particular center it may be, is always an image of the true center of the world. But the further the Kali-Yuga progresses, the more difficult it becomes to establish contact with this center, which becomes increasingly more closed and hidden at the same time that these secondary centers representing it externally become increasingly more rare. Yet when this period comes to an end, the tradition will be manifested anew in its integrality. For the beginning of each Manvantara, coinciding with the end of the preceding one, necessarily implies for terrestrial humanity the return to the primordial state. In Europe, every consciously established link with the center by means of regular organizations is now broken, and this has been so for several centuries. Moreover, this rupture was not accomplished all at once, but in many successive stages. The first stage dates from the beginning of the 14th century. What we have already said elsewhere makes it understandable that one of the principal roles of the orders of chivalry was to assure communication between East and West, the true importance of which will be readily grasped when it is recalled that the center here in question has always been depicted as located somewhere in the East, at least with respect to historical times. Nevertheless, after the destruction of the Order of the Templars, the Brotherhood of the Rose Cross, or what was later to be given that name, continued to assure this same communication, albeit in a more hidden way. The Renaissance and the Reformation marked a new critical phase, after which, as Saint-Yves appears to suggest, came the complete and final rupture, coinciding with the treaties of Westphalia that, in 1640-80, ended the 30 Years' War. Now it is remarkable that numerous writers have affirmed precisely that the true Brotherhood of the Rose Cross left Europe shortly after the 30 Years' War to withdraw into Asia. And in this regard, we recall that the Rosicrucian adepts were 12 in number, as were the members of the innermost circle of Agarttha, in conformity with the constitution common to so many other spiritual centers formed in the image of that supreme center. Since this last period, the deposit of effective initiatic knowledge has not truly been preserved by any Western organization. Thus, Swedenborg declared that the lost word must henceforth be sought among the sages of Tibet and of Tartary. And according to the visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich, the mysterious place that she calls the Mountain of Prophets is also set in the same regions. And let us add that the fragmentary information Madame Blavatsky was able to gather on this subject, though without fully understanding its true significance, gave rise to her idea of the Great White Lodge, which we would call not an image, but quite simply a caricature or fanciful parody of Agartha. Chapter 9. The Omphalos and Sacred Stones. According to Ossendowski's report, the King of the World formerly appeared several times in India and in Siam, and blessed the people with a golden apple with the figure of a lamb above it. And this detail takes on great importance when compared with what Saint-Yves says of the cycle of the lamb and the ram. From another point of view, it is even more remarkable that in Christian symbolism there exist innumerable representations of the Lamb on a mountain from which flow 4 rivers that are clearly identical with the 4 rivers of the terrestrial paradise. Now we have said that Agartha bore a different name prior to the onset of the Kali-Yuga, and that this name was Paradesha, which in Sanskrit means a supreme country, and which applies well to the spiritual center par excellence, also called the heart of the world. It is from this word that the Chaldeans formed Pardes and the Westerners paradise. Such is the original meaning of this latter, which should make clear why we said before that in one form or another it always signifies the same thing as the Pardes of the Hebrew Kabbalah. Moreover, referring back to what was said earlier concerning the symbolism of the pole, it is also easy to see that the mountain of the terrestrial paradise is identical with the polar mountain, which under various names exists in almost all traditions. We have already mentioned the Meru of the Hindus and the Alborz of the Persians, as well as Mont Salvat of the Western legend of the Grail. There are also the mountain Kaf of the Arabs and the Greek Olympus, which in many ways have the same significance. The region in question is always one that, like the terrestrial paradise, has become inaccessible to ordinary humanity, and lies beyond the reach of all cataclysms that rack the human world at the end of certain cyclical periods. This region is the veritable supreme country. Moreover, according to certain Vedic and Avestan texts, its location must originally have been polar, even in the literal sense of the word. And whatever its location may have been during the different phases of human history, it always remains polar in the symbolic sense, for it essentially represents the fixed axis around which the revolution of all things is accomplished. The mountain naturally represents the center of the world before the onset of the Kali-Yuga, that is to say, when it existed openly, as it were, and was not yet subterranean. It thus corresponded to what might be called its normal position, apart from the period of obscuration, the particular conditions of which imply a sort of reversal of the established order. It must also be added that apart from these considerations referring to cyclical laws, the symbols of the mountain and the cave, each have their own raison d'etre and are truly complementary. Moreover, the cave may be envisaged as located in the interior of the mountain itself, or as immediately beneath it. There are still other symbols in ancient traditions that represent the center of the world, one of the most remarkable perhaps being the Omphalos, which is likewise found among nearly all peoples. In Greek, the word means umbilicus or navel, but it also designates in a general way all that is central, and in particular the hub of a wheel. In Sanskrit, the word nabi has the same connotations, as do various words in the Celtic and Germanic languages derived from the same root, which is then found under the forms nab and nav. In Welsh, on the other hand, the word nav or naf, which is obviously related to the forms just mentioned, carries the sense of chief and is sometimes even applied to God. And so it is indeed the idea of the central principle that is being expressed here. The meaning hub has, besides, a very particular importance in this regard because the wheel is everywhere, a symbol of the world accomplishing its rotation around a fixed point, a symbol that must thus be compared to the swastika. But in the latter, the circumference representing manifestation is not depicted, so that it is the center itself that is expressly pointed to, the swastika then being not a representation of the world, but rather of the action of the principle in relation to the world. The symbol of the Omphalos could be situated in a place that was simply the center of a determined region, the spiritual center, of course, rather than the geographical one, although in certain cases the two might coincide. In cases where the latter held true, this was because for the people who inhabited the region in question, the place concerned was truly the visible image of the center of the world, just as the tradition proper to that people was only an adaptation of the primordial tradition, expressed in a form that best fitted its mentality and its conditions of existence. The Omphalos that is best known is the one in the temple at Delphi, which was quite certainly the spiritual center of all ancient Greece. And without dwelling on all the reasons that could justify the assertion, we will only note that it was at Delphi that the twice-yearly council of the Amphictyons assembled. This council was composed of representatives from all the Hellenic peoples, and moreover formed the only effective link between these peoples, the strength of which link lay in its essentially traditional character. The physical representation of the Omphalos was generally a sacred stone, commonly called a betel, a word that seems to be none other than the Hebrew Beth El, or house of God, the name given by Jacob to the place where the Lord appeared to him in a dream. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." So Jacob rose early in the morning, and he took the stone which he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on the top of it. He called the name of that place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at first. We have explained the meaning of the word Luz above. Moreover, it is also said that Beth El, house of God, later became Bethlehem, house of bread, which is the city where Christ was born. And the symbolic relationship existing between stone and bread is moreover most worthy of attention. We should point out that the name Beth El applies not only to the place, but to the stone itself. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar shall be God's house. So it is this stone that must be the true divine habitation, Mishkan, according to the designation given later to the tabernacle, that is, the seat of the Shekinah. All this is naturally connected to the subject of the spiritual influences, Barakoth. And when we speak of the cult of stones that was common to so many ancient peoples, it must be understood that this cult was not addressed to the stones themselves, but to the divinity whose dwelling place they were. The stone representing the Omphalos could take the form of a pillar like the stone of Jacob, and it is quite probable that among the Celtic peoples, certain menhirs had the same significance. And the oracles were uttered close by these stones, as at Delphi, which is easily explained by the fact that they were considered to be the dwelling place of the divinity, the house of God being moreover quite naturally identified with the center of the world. The Omphalos could also be represented in the form of a cone, like the black stone of Cybele, or of an ovoid, the cone recalling the sacred mountain, symbol of the pole or world axis, and the ovoid form relating directly to another very important symbol, the world egg. It should be added that the Omphalos, although usually represented by a stone, sometimes took the form of a mound or sort of tumulus, which again is an image of the sacred mountain. Thus, in China, for example, a mound in the shape of a quadrangular pyramid and formed from the earth of the 5 regions was formally raised in the center of every kingdom or feudal state. The 4 faces corresponded to the 4 cardinal points and its summit to the center itself. Strangely enough, these 5 regions are also to be found in Ireland, where the standing stone of the chieftain was raised in a similar way at the center of each domain. Among Celtic nations, it is in fact Ireland that furnishes the most information relative to the Omphalos. The country was formerly divided into 5 kingdoms, of which one bore the name Mede, still extant in its anglicized form Meath, from the ancient Celtic word median, middle, identical with the Latin medius. The kingdom of Mede, which had been formed of portions of land appropriated from the other 4 kingdoms, became the rightful appanage of Ireland's supreme king, to whom the other kings were subordinate. At Uisneach, situated almost exactly at the center of the country, there stood a gigantic stone called the Navel of the Earth, also called the Stone of the Portions, Eil Namiran, because it marked the place where the dividing boundaries of the 4 original kingdoms converged within the kingdom of Mede. On the first day of May each year, a general assembly was held there, very like the annual reunion of the Druids at their central consecrated place, Medio-Lannon or Medio-Nemeton, in Gaul, in the land of the Carnutes, the similarity here with the assembly of the Amphictyons at Delphi being evident. This division of Ireland into 4 kingdoms, together with the central region where its supreme ruler resided, is linked to very ancient traditions. It was indeed for this reason that Ireland was called the Isle of the 4 Masters, but this name, as well as that of Green Isle, Erin, had previously been applied to another far more northerly land called Ogygia, or rather Thule, now unknown and perhaps vanished, but once one of the principal spiritual centers, if not even the supreme one during a certain period. The memory of this Isle of 4 Masters is also found as far away as China, although this seems never to have been noticed before, as witnessed by this Taoist text. The Emperor Yao took a great deal of trouble and sincerely believed he had reigned in an ideal way. However, after his visit to the 4 Masters on the distant island of Kushi, inhabited by true men, Chen-Gen, that is to say, those who have been reintegrated into the primordial state, he realized that he had spoilt everything. The ideal, he discovered, consists of the indifference, or rather the detachment in activity that is non-action, of the superior man who allows the cosmic wheel to turn. From another point of view, the 4 Masters are identified with the 4 Maharajas, or great kings, who in the Indian and Tibetan traditions preside over the 4 cardinal points corresponding at the same time to the elements, while the Supreme Master, the 5th, who resides at the center on the sacred mountain, represents the ether, akasha, the quintessence, or quinta essentia of the Hermeticists, which is the primordial element from which the other 4 proceed, and analogous traditions are also to be found in Central America. Chapter 10. Names and Symbolic Representations of Spiritual Centers. As concerns the Supreme Country, many other concordant traditions could be cited, notably its designation by another name that is probably even more ancient than Paradesha. This is the name Tula, from which the Greeks derived Thula. And as we have just seen, Thule was probably identical with the original Isle of the 4 Masters. Moreover, this same name Tula was given to very diverse regions, so that even today it is still to be found as far afield as Russia and Central America, from which one must doubtless conclude that in some more or less remote age, each of these regions was the seat of a spiritual power that was an emanation, as it were, of that of the primordial Tula. We know that the Mexican Tula owes its origin to the Toltecs, who it is said came from Aztlan. They land in the midst of the waters, evidently none other than Atlantis, bringing with them the name Tula from their country of origin. The center to which they gave it had probably been intended to replace, in some measure, that of the lost continent. But it is also necessary to distinguish the Atlantean Tula and the Hyperborean Tula, the latter then truly representing the original and supreme center for the totality of the present Manvantara. It was this that was the sacred isle par excellence, having originally been situated quite literally at the pole, as we said above. All the other sacred isles, which everywhere bear names of identical meaning, were only its images. and this applies even to the spiritual center of the Atlantean tradition, which only presided over a secondary historical cycle subordinate to the Manvantara. In Sanskrit, the word Tula means scales, and denotes more specifically the zodiacal sign of that name, the scales, or Libra. There is, however, a Chinese tradition in which the heavenly scales were originally the Great Bear. This point is of the greatest importance, for the symbolism attached to the Great Bear is naturally connected in the closest possible way to that of the pole. But we cannot pursue this question here, for it demands its own special study. There would also be good reason to examine the connection that may exist between the polar scales and the zodiacal scales. This latter is regarded, moreover, as the sign of judgment, and what was said previously in connection with Melki-Tsedeq of the scales as an attribute of justice makes this name, that is, scales or Tula, comprehensible as the designation of the supreme spiritual center. Tula is also called the White Isle, the color white, as we have seen, representing spiritual authority. In the American, that is, Amerindian traditions, Aztlan is symbolized by a white mountain, but this symbolism originally applied to the Hyperborean Tula and the Polar Mountain. In India, the White Isle, Shvetadvipa, which was generally set in the remote regions of the north, is regarded as the abode of the blessed, which clearly identifies it with the land of the living. There is, however, an apparent exception in that Celtic traditions speak specifically of a green isle as the Isle of the Saints, or the Isle of the Blessed. In the center of this island there rises the White Mountain, which is said never to have been submerged in any deluge, and the summit of which is purple in color. This mountain of the sun, as it is also called, is the equivalent of Meru, which is the white mountain girded in green by virtue of the fact that it is situated in the middle of the sea, with a triangle of light shining at its summit. To the various designations of spiritual centers, such as White Isle, a designation that, like the others, could, we repeat, be applied not only to the supreme center, to which it originally appertained, but to secondary centers as well. We must add the names of places, countries, and cities that likewise express the idea of whiteness. These are numerous enough from Albion and Albania to Alba Longa, the mother city of Rome, and other ancient cities that may have borne the same name. Among the Greeks, the name of the city of Argos has the same signification. The reason for these facts will be made clear in what follows. Something remains to be said about the representation of a spiritual center as an island, one enclosing a sacred mountain, moreover, because while such a location could actually have existed, although not all holy lands were islands, it must have a symbolic meaning as well. Historical facts themselves, and especially those of sacred history, in fact translate in their own way truths of a superior order by reason of the law of correspondence that is the very foundation of symbolism, and that unites all the worlds in total and universal harmony. The idea evoked by the representation in question is essentially the stability that is also precisely what characterizes the pole. The island remains immovable amid the ceaseless tossing of the waves, which represents the agitations of the external world, and one must have crossed the sea of passions in order to reach the Mount of Salvation, the sanctuary of peace. Chapter 11, Location of Spiritual Centers. In the preceding, we have almost entirely left aside the question of the actual location of the Supreme Center, an extremely complex question that is in any case quite secondary from our chosen point of view. There seems good reason to envisage a number of successive locations corresponding to different cycles, which are themselves subdivisions of another, more extensive cycle called the Manvantara. Moreover, if we were to consider the latter in its totality by placing ourselves outside of time, as it were, there would be a hierarchical order to consider among these locations, corresponding to the constitution of traditional forms that are themselves really no more than adaptations of the principal and primordial tradition dominating the entire Manvantara. We should recall, however, that many other centers can exist simultaneously with the principal one, attached to and reflecting it like so many images, and this can easily lead to confusion, especially as these secondary centers, being more outward, are thereby more visible than the supreme center. In reference to this last point, we have already taken particular note of the similarity between Lhasa, the center of Lamaism, and Agarttha. We will now add that even in the West there are at least two cities, Rome and Jerusalem, whose topographical circumstances present peculiarities suggesting a comparable raison d'etre, and we have already seen that the latter was in effect a visible image of the mysterious Salem of Melki-Tsedeq. As we have already pointed out, there existed in ancient times what could be called a sacred or sacerdotal geography, and the placement of cities and temples was not arbitrary, but determined according to very precise laws. This may give us an inkling of the bonds that unite sacerdotal and royal art to the art of the builders, as well as of the reasons why the ancient guilds possessed an authentic initiatic tradition. Moreover, between the founding of a city and the establishment of a doctrine or of a new traditional form by adaptation to specific conditions of time and place, there was such a connection that the first was often taken to symbolize the second. Naturally, the most elaborate precautions were taken when fixing the placement of a city destined in one way or another to become the capital of a whole specified part of the world. And the names of such cities would merit careful study, as would also the reported circumstances of their founding. Without elaborating on questions that are only indirectly related to our present subject, we should nonetheless mention that a center of the kind just described existed in pre-Hellenic Crete, and that it seems that there were several in Egypt as well, probably founded in successive epochs, such as Memphis and Thebes. The name of the latter, which is also that of a Greek city, is of particular interest as a designation of a spiritual center by reason of its obvious connection with the Hebrew Theba, that is, the Ark of the Deluge. The latter is again a representation of the supreme center, especially in the sense of assuring the preservation of the tradition in a sort of shrouded state during the transitional period between two cycles marked by a cosmic cataclysm that destroys the previous state of the world in order to make place for a new one. The role of the biblical Noah is similar to that played in the Hindu tradition by Satyavrata, who, under the name Vaivasvata, later became the current Manu. But it should be noted that whereas this latter tradition goes back to the beginning of the present Manvantara, the biblical deluge marks only the advent of another, more restricted cycle comprised within this same Manvantara. They do not represent the same event, but two analogous ones. Even more noteworthy is the association that exists between the symbolism of the ark and that of the rainbow, and relationship suggested in the biblical text by the appearance of the latter after the deluge as a sign of the covenant between God and earthly creatures. During the cataclysm, the ark floated on the ocean of the lower waters. Then, at the moment marking the re-establishment of order and the renewal of all things, the rainbow appeared in the clouds, that is to say, in the region of the upper waters. It is therefore an analogical relationship in the strictest sense, the two figures being inverse and complementary to each other, the convex shape of the ark being directed downward and that of the rainbow upward, so that together they form a complete circular or cyclical figure, of which they comprise, as it were, the two halves. At the beginning of the cycle, this figure was in fact complete. It is the vertical section of a sphere, the horizontal section of which is represented by the circular enclosure of the terrestrial paradise, and the latter is divided by a cross formed by the four rivers issuing from the polar mountain. The reconstitution must be accomplished at the end of the same cycle, but then, in the case of the celestial Jerusalem, the circle is replaced by a square, indicating the accomplishment of what the Hermeticists designated symbolically as the squaring of the circle. The sphere, representing the development of possibilities through the expansion of the primordial central point, is transformed into a cube when this development is completed and the final equilibrium for the cycle under consideration is attained. Chapter 12. Some conclusions. One conclusion that emerges clearly from the concordant testimonies of all traditions is that there is a holy land par excellence, that it is the prototype for all other holy lands, and that it is the spiritual center to which all others are subordinate. The Holy Land is also the land of the saints, the land of the blessed, the land of the living, and the land of immortality. All these expressions are equivalent, and we should add to their number the pure land, which Plato applies precisely to the abode of the blessed. This abode is usually said to be situated in an invisible world, but this can only be understood if we do not forget that the same applies to the spiritual hierarchies of which all traditions speak, and which in fact represent degrees of initiation. In the present period of our terrestrial cycle, that is, during the Kali-Yuga, this holy land, defended by guardians who keep it hidden from profane view while nevertheless assuring certain exterior relations, is in fact invisible and inaccessible, though only to those who do not possess the necessary qualifications to enter it. Should its location in a definite place then be taken literally, or only symbolically, or as both at the same time? To this we will answer only that for us, geographical facts as well as historical facts possess, as do all facts, a symbolic import, which obviously takes nothing away from the reality proper to them as such, but rather confers upon them a higher significance in addition to this immediate reality. We do not claim that we have said all there is to say on the present subject, far from it, in fact, for the relationships we have established could assuredly suggest many others. But in spite of everything, this study has certainly gone further than any preceding it, and some will perhaps be tempted to reproach us for that. However, we do not believe that too much has been said, and are even persuaded that there is nothing that should not be said, although we are doubtless less disposed than anyone to dispute the fact that there is reason to consider opportuneness when it is a question of making public certain matters of a somewhat unusual character. On the question of opportuneness, only this brief observation need be made. Under the circumstances in which we presently live, events unfold with such rapidity that many things, the reasons for which are not immediately obvious, could well find rather unforeseen applications, if not altogether unforeseeable ones, and this sooner than we may wish to believe. We wish to refrain from anything that may in any way resemble prophesying, but will nevertheless cite here by way of a fitting conclusion the following words of Joseph de Maistre, which are even truer today than they were a century ago. We must be ready for an immense event in the divine order, which we are traveling toward with an accelerated speed that must astound all those who watch. Redoubtable oracles have already announced that the time has arrived.